The cardboard box hit the concrete floor of the garage with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. Margaret Sullivan stood over it, hands on her hips, her face flushed with frustration as she surveyed the cluttered space that had become a monument to what she called her husband's obsession. Rolled maps, dozens of them, some yellowed with age, others crisp and new, filled every corner, every shelf, every available surface. To her, they were just paper. Just junk. Just another reminder of a man who seemed more interested in places he had been than the life he was living now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But to Thomas Sullivan, those maps were everything. And somewhere in that garage, hidden among the cartographic chaos, was a secret that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about her husband, about their marriage, and about the quiet German shepherd named Sargent who watched them both with eyes that held more understanding than either of them realized. The morning had started like so many others in the Sullivan household, with silence. Not the comfortable silence of a couple at peace, but the heavy, loaded quiet of two people who had forgotten how to talk to each other. Thomas had been up since dawn, as he always was, moving through the house like a ghost, careful not to disturb his wife as she slept in what had once been their shared bedroom but was now effectively hers alone. He made his coffee in the kitchen, the old percolator bubbling and hissing, filling the air with a rich aroma that reminded him of mornings in places far from here, mornings when purpose had been clear and the mission had been everything. At 62 years old, Thomas Sullivan was a man who looked like he had been carved from something harder than ordinary flesh. His frame was still solid despite the years, broad shoulders that had carried wounded men across impossible terrain now slightly stooped from the weight of civilian life. His hair, once a dark brown, had gone completely silver, cut in the same military precision he had maintained for 40 years. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, but it was his eyes themselves that told the real story. They were a pale gray, the color of storm clouds over the ocean, and they held a distance in them, as if part of him was always looking at something far away, something no one else could see. He wore what he always wore around the house, faded blue jeans that had seen better days, a plain gray Henley shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and an old pair of work boots that he had resoled 3 times because he could not bring himself to throw them away. On his left wrist was a watch, a simple military-issue timepiece that had stopped working years ago but that he wore anyway, a talisman from a life that felt increasingly distant. The only sound in the kitchen besides the coffee pot was the soft click of Sargent's nails on the linoleum floor as the dog padded over to sit beside Thomas. Sargent was a magnificent animal, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a coat of deep sable and black, his intelligent brown eyes missing nothing. He had been Thomas's partner for 7 years, a military working dog who had served 3 tours overseas before retiring along with Thomas. The dog was more than a pet. He was a brother in arms, the one living being who truly understood what Thomas had seen, what he had done, and what he carried. Thomas reached down and scratched behind Sargent's ears, and the dog leaned into the touch, his tail giving a slow, measured wag. In that simple gesture was a communication more profound than any words Thomas had exchanged with his wife in months. The dog understood. The dog always understood. Margaret appeared in the doorway at 7:30, exactly as she did every weekday morning. She was 58, a woman who had once been striking in her beauty and who still carried herself with a certain rigid grace. Her auburn hair, now threaded heavily with gray, was pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a crisp white blouse and dark slacks, the uniform of her work as an office manager at a medical practice downtown. Her face, once soft and open, had hardened over the years into an expression of perpetual disappointment. The lines around her mouth seemed to pull downward, as if she had forgotten how to smile. She moved through the kitchen without looking at Thomas, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot he had made, adding her cream and sugar with mechanical precision. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. It had not always been this way. There had been a time, decades ago, when they had been happy. When he had come home on leave and she had run into his arms, when they had talked for hours about their dreams, about the life they would build together when his service was done. But that life, those dreams, had somehow gotten lost in translation between the war zone and the home front. Thomas cleared his throat, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. He was going to sort through some things in the garage today, he said, his voice rough from disuse. The maps. I thought I would organize them properly. Margaret's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she stirred her coffee, then continued. Those maps, she said, and there was a sharp edge to her voice that made even Sargent's ears twitch. Thomas, we have talked about this. That garage is filled with junk. Boxes and boxes of old paper that you will never use. You have been home for 3 years now. 3 years. And you still act like you are preparing for some mission that is never going to come. They are not junk, Thomas said quietly, but there was no force behind the words. He had learned long ago that defending himself to Margaret was pointless. She had made up her mind about who he was, about what mattered to him, and nothing he said would change that. They are maps of places you have already been, Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly. Places you cannot go back to. What is the point of keeping them? What are you holding on to? The past is over, Thomas. We are supposed to be living in the present, building something here, but instead you spend all your time out in that garage with your dog, surrounded by reminders of a life that does not exist anymore. Thomas looked down at his coffee, the dark liquid reflecting the overhead light like a pool of ink. He wanted to tell her that those maps were not just paper. They were memories. They were proof that he had mattered once, that he had done things that were important. Each map marked a place where he had made a difference, where his skills had saved lives, where his decisions had meant something. But he knew she would not understand. She had never understood. Instead, he simply nodded. I will get rid of some of them, he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. I will go through them today and see what can be thrown out. Margaret finished her coffee, rinsed the cup in the sink with brisk efficiency, and picked up her purse from the counter. I am working late tonight, she said, not looking at him. There is a quarterly meeting. Do not wait up. And please, Thomas, really do something about that garage. I cannot even park my car in there anymore. She left without saying goodbye, the front door closing behind her with a soft click that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. Thomas sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she was gone, Sargent's warm weight pressed against his leg, the only comfort in a house that had stopped feeling like a home. The garage was Thomas's sanctuary and his prison. It was a large 2-car space attached to the side of their modest ranch-style house in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with other military retirees and middle-class families, the kind of place where everyone mowed their lawns on Saturday and waved to each other from a polite distance. It was safe. It was orderly. And to Thomas, it felt like a cage. He opened the side door of the garage, and Sargent immediately trotted inside, his nose twitching as he investigated the familiar scents. The space was indeed cluttered, but to Thomas, it was organized chaos. Metal shelving units lined the walls, each one filled with carefully labeled boxes. There were boxes of field manuals, boxes of old gear, boxes of photographs he could not bring himself to look at. And then there were the maps. They were everywhere. Topographical maps of mountain ranges in Afghanistan, street maps of cities in Iraq, nautical charts of coastlines in Somalia, aviation maps marked with flight paths and coordinates. Some were official military issue, printed on waterproof paper and marked with classified stamps that had long since been declassified. Others were personal acquisitions, maps he had bought or traded for, maps he had annotated with his own handwriting, marking safe routes, danger zones, extraction points, places where men had lived and died. Thomas pulled a rolled map from one of the shelves at random and spread it out on the workbench that dominated the center of the garage. It was a map of the Hindu Kush mountain range, the peaks marked in shades of brown and white, the valleys rendered in green. He ran his finger along a red line he had drawn years ago, a route his team had taken to reach a downed helicopter. He could still remember every step of that journey, the thin air that made breathing feel like drowning, the cold that seeped into your bones, the constant fear of ambush. But he also remembered the faces of the pilots they had pulled from the wreckage, the gratitude in their eyes, the weight of their bodies as he had helped carry them down the mountain to safety. That was who he had been. A United States Army Ranger, a search and rescue specialist, a man who ran toward danger when everyone else was running away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had spent 22 years in uniform, earning commendations and scars in equal measure. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, had made decisions that saved lives and decisions that haunted him. And when he had finally retired, when the army had told him his time was done, he had come home expecting to find peace. Instead, he had found emptiness. Margaret had built a life without him during his long deployments. She had her job, her routines, her friends from book club and yoga class. She had learned to be independent, to make decisions without him, to fill the space he left behind. And when he came home for good, there was no room for him anymore. He was a disruption, an inconvenience, a reminder of a part of her life she seemed eager to forget. He had tried, in the beginning. He had gone to barbecues with the neighbors, had attempted to find work as a consultant for outdoor recreation companies, had even taken a class at the community college on landscape photography. But nothing stuck. Nothing felt real. The civilian world operated on rules he did not understand, valued things that seemed trivial to him. People complained about traffic and bad service at restaurants while he remembered children who had walked 10 miles for clean water. The gap between his experience and theirs felt unbridgeable. So he had retreated to the garage, to his maps, to the only companion who understood him. Sergeant had his own struggles with civilian life. The dog had been trained for war, his senses honed to detect explosives, to find hidden enemies, to work in chaos and danger. Retirement meant long, boring days with nothing to do, no mission to complete, no purpose. Thomas saw his own struggle reflected in the dog's eyes, and it created a bond between them that went beyond the typical relationship between a man and his pet. Thomas spent the morning going through the maps methodically, pulling them from shelves, unrolling them, remembering the stories they held. He made piles on the garage floor, telling himself he was sorting them for disposal, but in reality, he was reliving his past, touching each memory like a talisman. Sergeant lay on an old blanket in the corner, watching with patient eyes, occasionally getting up to sniff at a particularly interesting map before returning to his spot. Around noon, Thomas heard a car pull into the driveway. He looked up, surprised. Margaret was not supposed to be home until late. He walked to the garage door and opened it to see his wife stepping out of her sedan, her face set in an expression he had learned to dread. It was the look she got when she had made a decision, when her mind was made up and nothing would change it. "I left work early," she announced, walking past him into the garage. "I told them I had a family emergency, which I suppose is true in a way. Thomas, we need to talk. Really talk." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He gestured to the workbench, the only clear surface in the cluttered space, but Margaret shook her head. "This is not a conversation we can have standing in a garage surrounded by junk," she said. "But since you spend all your time here, I suppose it will have to do." She looked around at the maps spread across the floor, at the boxes stacked on the shelves, at Sergeant lying in his corner, and her face hardened. "This, Thomas. This is exactly what I am talking about. You are living in the past. You cannot let go. Every single day you come out here and you lose yourself in these maps, these memories, these places you will never see again. And meanwhile, I am trying to build a life, our life, and you are not here. You are never here." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. "I am not finished. I have been patient. God knows I have been patient. For 3 years I have watched you retreat further and further into yourself. I have invited you to do things, to meet people, to engage with the world, and you always have an excuse. You are tired. You are not feeling well. You have things to do in the garage. But we both know what you are really doing. You are hiding. You are hiding from me, from this life, from the fact that your army career is over and you need to figure out who you are now. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it was not that simple, that she did not understand what it was like to have your entire identity stripped away, to go from being essential to being irrelevant. But the look in her eyes stopped him. There was anger there, yes, but underneath it was something worse. There was resignation. There was defeat. "I spoke to a lawyer this morning," Margaret said, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I am not saying I have made any final decisions, but I wanted to know what my options were. Thomas, I cannot keep living like this. I cannot keep being married to a ghost. You are here physically, but you are not really here. And I am lonely. I am so lonely in my own home, in my own marriage, and I cannot do it anymore." The word lawyer hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Thomas felt the floor shift beneath him, felt the walls of the garage close in. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and saw for the first time how tired she was, how worn down. The lines around her eyes were not just from age. They were from sadness, from years of trying to reach a man who kept moving further away. He wanted to say something, anything, to fix this, but the words would not come. His throat felt tight, his chest constricted. He had faced enemy fire, had made life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure, but this moment, standing in his garage with his wife telling him their marriage was over, left him completely paralyzed. Margaret waited for him to speak, and when he did not, she nodded as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "I want you to get rid of these maps, Thomas," she said, her voice now completely flat, emotionless. "Not some of them. All of them. I want this garage cleared out by the end of the week. I want you to prove to me that you can let go of the past and be present in the now. Otherwise, I do not see how we can move forward." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And I am serious about the lawyer," she added without looking back. "I am giving you 1 week. 1 week to show me that our marriage is worth fighting for. Otherwise, I am done." The door closed behind her, and Thomas stood alone in the garage, surrounded by the maps that had once been his whole world. He felt Sargent press against his leg, the dog's solid warmth the only thing keeping him grounded. He looked down at the animal, and Sargent looked back with those knowing brown eyes, eyes that held understanding and loyalty and something that looked almost like pity. Thomas sank down onto the concrete floor, his back against the workbench, and for the first time in years, he felt tears sting his eyes. He had survived firefights and explosions, had endured physical pain that would have broken most men, but this quiet devastation in his own home was something he did not know how to fight. Margaret's ultimatum was clear. The maps or the marriage. The past or the future. And he had no idea how to choose. Sargent lay down beside him, resting his large head on Thomas's lap, and they sat there together in the dim light of the garage, 2 soldiers without a war, 2 souls searching for a mission that seemed to have disappeared. The rest of that day passed in a haze. Thomas heard Margaret moving around inside the house, heard the sounds of her making dinner, the television turning on, the routine noises of domestic life continuing as if the world had not just cracked open. He could not bring himself to go inside. Instead, he remained in the garage, sitting on the floor with Sargent, staring at the maps spread around him like the pieces of a shattered mirror. As evening fell and the light fading through the single dusty window turned golden then gray, Thomas finally forced himself to move. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold concrete, and began to methodically roll up the maps. Each one felt heavier than it should, as if the paper itself had absorbed the weight of the memories it represented. He placed them back in their boxes, stacking the boxes neatly along the wall, a temporary reprieve before their final disposal. He worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of paper and Sargent's quiet breathing. The dog had not left his side all day, his presence a constant, faithful vigil. As Thomas sealed the last box with packing tape, he felt a profound sense of loss, as if he were attending a funeral for a version of himself that had died without his permission. That night, he slept on the old couch in his small home office, a room that had become his de facto bedroom over the past year. He could hear Margaret moving around in the master bedroom down the hall, could hear the water running as she prepared for bed, could hear the soft click of her bedside lamp turning off. The house settled into its nightly quiet, but Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about the 22 years he had given to the army, the sacrifices he had made, the things he had seen. He thought about the men and women he had served with, some of whom had not made it home. He thought about the weight of responsibility he had carried, the knowledge that his decisions meant the difference between life and death. And he thought about how none of that seemed to matter anymore, how all of it had been reduced to junk in a garage, an obstacle to a marriage that was falling apart. But more than anything, he thought about Margaret's words. "You are hiding." Was that true? Was he hiding? Or was he simply trying to hold on to the only identity he had ever known? The question circled in his mind without resolution, and eventually, exhaustion claimed him, pulling him into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams of mountains and missions and maps that led nowhere. The next morning brought rain, a steady autumn drizzle that turned the world outside gray and blurred. Thomas woke early again, his body conditioned by decades of military discipline to rise before the sun despite his lack of sleep. He made coffee, fed Sergeant, and stood at the kitchen window watching the rain streak down the glass. Margaret had already left for work, her car gone from the driveway, her presence marked only by a rinsed coffee cup in the sink and a note on the counter that said simply, "Remember what I said." 1 week. Thomas crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, then immediately felt guilty and retrieved it, smoothing it out and placing it on the counter as if that small act of care could somehow make up for the larger failures. He poured a second cup of coffee and carried it out to the garage, Sergeant trailing behind him, the dog's nails clicking on the linoleum then going silent on the concrete. The boxes of maps sat where he had left them, stacked neatly against the wall, a monument to Margaret's ultimatum. Thomas set his coffee on the workbench and stared at them, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could do as she asked. He could load these boxes into his truck, drive them to the recycling center, watch them disappear into the machinery that would reduce them to pulp. It would be simple. It would be final. And it would prove to Margaret that he was willing to let go, to choose their future over his past. But even as he thought it, he knew he could not do it. Not yet. Not without understanding why these maps mattered so much, why the thought of destroying them felt like erasing proof of his own existence. He needed time. He needed to figure out what he was really holding on to and whether Margaret was right about him hiding. He pulled out one of the boxes at random and opened it, selecting a map from the middle of the stack. It was a detailed tactical map of a region in northern Iraq, dated from his second deployment. The paper was marked with notations in his own handwriting, coordinates and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone else but that told him a complete story. He remembered this mission, remembered the intel they had received about a kidnapped aid worker, remembered the planning and the execution and the moment they had found her, dehydrated and terrified but alive. He spread the map on the workbench, his fingers tracing the route they had taken. It had been a good mission, a successful mission, one of the ones that reminded him why he had chosen this life. But as he stared at the map now, in the gray light of his garage with the rain drumming on the roof, he realized that Margaret might have a point. What good did it do him to relive this success? The aid worker had been returned to her family, the mission had been completed, the memory existed in his mind. Did he really need this physical map to prove it had happened? Sergeant, who had been lying on his blanket, suddenly stood up, his ears alert, his body tense. The dog walked to the closed garage door, his nose working at the gap beneath it, and let out a low, rumbling growl. Thomas immediately went still, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where he once would have carried a sidearm. Old habits. He moved quietly to stand beside Sergeant, listening. At first, he heard nothing but the rain. Then, faintly, he picked up the sound of footsteps in the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate, trying to be quiet. Someone was outside. Thomas's heart rate picked up, not with fear but with a sudden clarity, an activation of instincts that had lain dormant for 3 years. He placed a hand on Sergeant's back, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles, the readiness. The footsteps stopped just outside the garage door. Thomas waited, counting seconds in his head, calculating angles and responses. Then came a soft knock, polite and almost hesitant. Whoever was out there was not trying to break in. They were announcing themselves. Thomas relaxed slightly but kept his hand on Sargent as he called out, "Who is it?" A voice came through the door, muffled by the rain and the metal. "Mr. Sullivan? Thomas Sullivan? My name is Marcus Chen. I am sorry to bother you, but I was told you might be able to help me. I am looking for someone, and I think you might be the only person who can find him." Thomas opened the garage door slowly, revealing a man standing in the rain. Marcus Chen was perhaps 35 years old, Asian American, wearing a dark waterproof jacket that glistened with moisture and jeans that were soaked from the knees down. His black hair was plastered to his forehead, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held a desperate intensity that Thomas recognized immediately. He had seen that look before, on the faces of people who had lost someone and were clinging to their last thread of hope. "Come inside," Thomas said, stepping back to allow the stranger entry. "You are getting soaked." Marcus hesitated at the threshold, glancing down at Sargent, who stood alert beside Thomas, no longer growling but clearly watchful. "The dog is fine," Thomas assured him. "He will not hurt you unless I tell him to." That seemed to be enough reassurance. Marcus stepped into the garage, and Thomas closed the door behind him, shutting out the sound of the rain. The man looked around at the stacks of boxes, the maps on the workbench, the military gear visible on the shelves, taking it all in with quick, assessing glances. "Thank you for letting me in," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "I know this is strange, showing up unannounced. But I did not know where else to go." Thomas gestured to an old folding chair near the workbench, and Marcus sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Thomas remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture automatically adopting the stance of an interviewer, someone gathering information. Sargent positioned himself between the two men, his eyes fixed on Marcus, reading him the way only a trained dog could. "You said you were looking for someone," Thomas prompted. "Who told you to come to me?" Marcus took off his glasses and wiped them on his shirt, a nervous gesture that revealed the tremor in his hands. "My grandfather," he said quietly. "James Chen. He was in the army. He served in Vietnam. He said if anyone could help me find my brother, it would be Thomas Sullivan. He said you were the best tracker he ever knew, that you could find anyone anywhere if you put your mind to it." The name James Chen pulled at something in Thomas's memory. He sorted through decades of faces and names, trying to place it. Finally, it clicked. "Jimmy Chen," he said aloud. "We served together in the Rangers. Good man. Good soldier. He made it home?" "He did," Marcus confirmed, putting his glasses back on. "He lives in Seattle now. Retired. He talks about his service days sometimes, and your name has come up more than once. He always said you had an uncanny ability to read terrain, to track people through impossible conditions. He said you saved his life once in a jungle when everyone else had given up on finding the platoon." Thomas felt an unexpected warmth at hearing his old friend remembered him, that his skills had left an impression that lasted decades. But he pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the present. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I am retired now. I have not done that kind of work in years. What makes you think I can help you?" Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping. "My younger brother, David, disappeared 6 weeks ago. He was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, doing a section through Oregon and Washington. He was supposed to check in every few days, but his last contact was from a town called Cascade Locks. After that, nothing. No phone calls, no social media posts, no credit card activity. It is like he vanished." Thomas felt his professional instincts engaging despite himself. He walked to the workbench and pulled out a chair, sitting down across from Marcus. "The police have been notified?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to confirm the basics. "Yes," Marcus said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I filed a missing persons report. Search and rescue teams went out. They found his campsite near a trailhead, his tent still set up, some of his gear still there. But no sign of David himself. The official search was called off after 2 weeks. They said there were no leads, no evidence of foul play, that he probably just decided to go off-grid for a while. They told me to wait, that he would turn up eventually. But you do not believe that, Thomas said. It was not a question. No, Marcus said firmly. David would never do that. He is 28 years old, responsible, cautious. He is a graduate student in environmental science. He loves the outdoors, but he is not reckless. He always tells someone where he is going, always checks in. Something happened to him. I know it. And the police have given up. Thomas was quiet for a moment, weighing what he was hearing against his own situation. He glanced at the boxes of maps stacked against the wall, Margaret's ultimatum heavy in his mind. This was exactly the kind of thing she was talking about, exactly the kind of distraction from their life together that she had asked him to stop pursuing. Getting involved in a search for a missing hiker would mean diving back into the world he was supposed to be leaving behind. But as he looked at Marcus Chen, at the raw desperation in his eyes, at the way his hands shook with the effort of holding himself together, Thomas felt something stir inside him that had been dormant for 3 years. It was the call of a mission, the pull of purpose, the knowledge that he had skills that could make a difference between a family finding closure and a family spending the rest of their lives wondering what happened to someone they loved. I am sorry about your brother, Thomas said carefully, and he meant it. But I am not sure I am the right person to help you. I have not been in the field in years. My tracking skills, my navigation abilities, they were developed for military operations in foreign terrain. The Pacific Crest Trail is different. There are professionals who specialize in wilderness search and rescue. Have you contacted any of them? I have, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. I have contacted everyone I can think of. But they all say the same thing. Without fresh leads, without some indication of where to look, the search area is too vast. The trail runs for hundreds of miles through some of the most remote wilderness in the country. They need something to go on, some clue to narrow down where he might be. And I do not have that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a plastic Ziploc bag, slightly damp from the rain. Inside was a small notebook, its cover stained and wrinkled. I found this in David's apartment when I was going through his things, Marcus explained, handing the bag to Thomas. It is his trail journal. He was documenting his hike, taking notes about the places he saw, the people he met. The last entry is dated the day before he disappeared. He mentioned something strange, something that did not make sense to me. I thought maybe it would mean something to someone with your experience. Thomas opened the bag and carefully removed the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, observations about the landscape, sketches of plants and birds, the musings of someone deeply engaged with the natural world. He flipped to the last entry, dated 6 weeks earlier. The entry read, "Camped near Eagle Creek tonight. Beautiful area but something feels off. Met a strange guy on the trail this afternoon, older man, maybe 60, carrying way more gear than anyone would need for a day hike. He was cagey when I asked where he was coming from, changed the subject quickly. Later, I noticed he was marking trees. Not trail markers, something else. Symbols carved into the bark. Circles with lines through them. Asked a ranger about it at the trailhead and he looked uncomfortable, said to stay on the main trail and not wander into the old mining areas. Makes me curious. Might explore tomorrow before I head north." Thomas read the entry twice, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the garage. He looked up at Marcus. "Did you show this to the police, to the search and rescue teams?" "Yes," Marcus said. "They said it was probably nothing, just David being curious. They said the old mining areas are well marked and fenced off, that it would be hard to get into them accidentally. But I keep thinking about those symbols he mentioned. Circles with lines through them. What if they mean something? What if he found something he was not supposed to find?" Thomas set the notebook down on the workbench and stood, pacing to the other side of the garage. His mind was racing, connecting dots that might not be there, seeing patterns that could be coincidence. but in his experience, coincidences were rare. When something felt wrong, it usually was wrong. He thought about the symbols David had described, about the strange man with too much gear, about the ranger's discomfort. It painted a picture of something hidden, something protected. Sargent had moved closer to the workbench, his nose working at the plastic bag that held the journal. The dog let out a soft whine, then looked up at Thomas with an expression that was almost imploring. Thomas walked back and stood beside the dog, his hand automatically going to Sargent's head. "You smell something," he asked quietly, though he knew the dog could not answer. Marcus watched this exchange with growing hope. "Your dog," he said tentatively. "Is he trained for search and rescue?" "He was," Thomas replied. "Military working dog. 3 tours overseas. Explosives detection, search and rescue, tracking. He is retired now, same as me. We both are. But he still has his training," Marcus pressed. "He could still do it if he needed to." Thomas looked down at Sargent, and the dog looked back, his brown eyes alert and focused in a way they had not been in years. The truth was, Thomas did not know. Sargent had not worked a real mission since they had both left the service. The dog spent his days lying on his blanket in the garage, going on short walks around the neighborhood, sleeping in the sun. Had he retained his skills, or had they atrophied like Thomas feared his own had? "I do not know," Thomas admitted. "It has been a long time." "But you could try," Marcus said, and there was a pleading quality to his voice now. "Mr. Sullivan, I am not asking you to commit to anything. I am just asking you to look. To take the journal, maybe look at some maps of the area, see if anything stands out to you. If you think there is nothing there, I will accept that and I will find another way. But my grandfather swears by you. He said if anyone could read between the lines, could see what others miss, it would be you." Thomas felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was a fork in the road, a choice that would determine not just whether he helped this young man find his brother, but what kind of person Thomas Sullivan was going to be for the rest of his life. He could say no. He could send Marcus Chen away, return to the task of packing up his maps, try to salvage his marriage by proving to Margaret that he could let go of his past. That was the safe choice, the choice that aligned with what his wife wanted, what she had all but demanded. Or he could say yes. He could take the journal, look at the maps, see if there was something the official searchers had missed. It would mean going against Margaret's wishes. It would mean admitting that he was not ready to let go, that the soldier in him was still alive and still needed a mission. It would almost certainly mean conflict, possibly mean the end of his marriage. But as he looked at Marcus Chen, at the desperate hope in his eyes, Thomas knew what his answer had to be. He had spent his entire adult life helping people, saving people, finding people who were lost. That was who he was at his core. And if being that person cost him his marriage, then maybe the marriage was already lost anyway. "I will look," Thomas said finally. "I am not promising anything beyond that. But I will take the journal, I will study the area, and I will tell you honestly if I think there is anything to find. Give me your contact information." The relief that washed over Marcus's face was profound. He pulled out his phone and they exchanged numbers, and Marcus wrote down his address on a piece of paper from the workbench. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much. I know this is asking a lot, especially from a stranger. But I did not know where else to turn." After Marcus left, driving away in a small sedan that disappeared into the rain, Thomas stood in the garage holding the trail journal. Sargent sat beside him, and Thomas could feel the change in the dog's demeanor. The animal was more alert now, his ears up, his body poised. He sensed something was different, that the long quiet of retirement might be coming to an end. Thomas walked to the wall where he had stacked the boxes of maps the night before. He found the one labeled Pacific Northwest and pulled it down, carrying it to the workbench. Inside were topographical maps of Oregon and Washington, including detailed maps of the areas around the Pacific Crest Trail. He spread out a map of the Columbia River Gorge, the region where David Chen had last been seen. Eagle Creek was marked clearly, a popular hiking area known for its waterfalls and old-growth forest, Thomas traced the trail with his finger, following the main route, then examining the surrounding terrain. Just to the west, marked with faded symbols that most people would overlook, were notations about old mining operations. The mines dated back to the late 1800s, part of a brief gold rush that had brought prospectors into these mountains before playing out. Most of the mines had been abandoned for over a century, their entrances collapsed or sealed by the Forest Service for safety. But Thomas knew that official closures did not always mean complete security. Remote areas were hard to monitor, and determined people could find ways into places they were not supposed to be. He thought about the symbols David had mentioned, circles with lines through them, and about the old man marking trees. It suggested someone maintaining a perimeter, someone who did not want visitors. He pulled out another map, this one geological, showing the underground structure of the region. The mining tunnels formed a network beneath the surface, some of them connecting to natural cave systems. On paper, they were all closed and dangerous. But if someone had reopened them, if someone was using them for something they wanted to keep hidden, it would explain the territorial behavior David had witnessed. Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon deep in the maps, making notes, circling areas of interest, plotting possible search routes. He was so absorbed in the work that he did not hear Margaret's car pull into the driveway, did not hear her come into the house. It was only when the door between the house and garage opened and she stood there, her purse over her shoulder, her face already set in an expression of displeasure, that he looked up and realized how much time had passed. "Thomas, what is all this?" she asked, and there was an edge to her voice. "I thought you were packing up the maps, not spreading more of them out." He stood, suddenly aware of how this must look, how it directly contradicted everything she had asked of him. "A man came to see me today," he began, trying to find the right words. "His brother is missing. He asked for my help." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And you said yes?" "Of course you did. Thomas, we talked about this. We talked about this yesterday. You have 1 week to show me you can prioritize our marriage, and the first thing you do is take on some stranger's problem." "It is not some stranger's problem," Thomas said, his voice rising slightly despite his effort to stay calm. "It is a missing person. A young man who was hiking and disappeared. The official search was called off. His family has nowhere else to turn." "And that is tragic," Margaret said, her voice hard. "It truly is. But it is not your responsibility. You are not in the army anymore, Thomas. You do not have to save everyone. You certainly do not have to save everyone at the expense of your own life, your own marriage." "What if I can help?" Thomas asked, and there was a pleading quality to his own voice now. "What if I have skills that could make the difference? Am I supposed to just ignore that? Am I supposed to let someone stay lost because it is inconvenient for me to help?" "Yes," Margaret said flatly. "Yes, that is exactly what I am asking you to do. Because every time you do this, every time you take on someone else's crisis, you leave me behind. You disappear into your mission and I become invisible. I have been invisible to you for 3 years, Thomas. And I am done competing with your need to be a hero." "I am not trying to be a hero," Thomas shot back. "I am trying to help someone who needs it. There is a difference." "Is there?" Margaret asked, and her voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Because from where I stand, it looks exactly the same. It looks like you finding any excuse to avoid dealing with us, with our problems, with the fact that this marriage is dying and you are letting it happen." The words hung between them, brutal and true. Thomas wanted to deny it, to argue, but the truth was that Margaret was not entirely wrong. He had been avoiding their problems, retreating into his maps and his memories because facing the reality of their failed marriage was more painful than any physical danger he had ever encountered. But he also knew that giving up who he was, abandoning the core of his identity, would not save the marriage either. It would just make him resent her, and himself. "I am going to help him," Thomas said quietly. "I am sorry if that is not what you want to hear. But there is a young man missing, and I might be able to find him. I have to try." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes, he saw something break. "Fine," she said, her voice completely flat. "You do what you need to do. but do not expect me to be here when you get back." She turned and walked back into the house, and a moment later Thomas heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the bedroom door close with a decisive click. He stood in the garage, the maps spread out before him, feeling like he had just lost something irretrievable. But even as the pain of it settled into his chest, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. Sargent walked over and pressed against his leg, and Thomas reached down to bury his fingers in the dog's thick fur. "Looks like it is just you and me again, boy," he said quietly. "Just like old times." The dog's tail gave a single thump against the concrete floor, and in that simple gesture, Thomas found a measure of peace. He had lost his wife's faith, possibly his marriage, but he had not lost himself. Not yet. That night, Thomas did not even attempt to go into the house. He knew Margaret had meant what she said, knew that any attempt at reconciliation right now would only make things worse. Instead, he set up a sleeping bag on the floor of the garage, using a duffel bag as a pillow, and Sargent curled up beside him. The concrete was hard and cold, but he had slept in far worse conditions. The physical discomfort was almost welcome, a distraction from the emotional turmoil. He lay awake for hours, listening to the rain drum on the roof, staring up at the dark ceiling, his mind alternating between the map problem he was trying to solve and the marriage problem he did not know how to fix. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep punctuated by dreams of tunnels and darkness and voices calling for help that he could not reach. He woke before dawn, his body stiff and aching. Sargent was already up, sitting by the garage door, waiting patiently. Thomas let the dog out into the backyard to relieve himself, then brought him back in and fed him from the supplies Thomas kept in the garage. He made instant coffee using a camping stove, the bitter brew more about function than taste, and stood drinking it while studying the maps again with fresh eyes. In the early morning light, a pattern began to emerge that he had not seen the night before. The old mining areas were clustered in a particular section of the mountains, forming a rough triangle. If someone wanted to use those mines for something illegal, something they needed to keep hidden, they would need to control access to that entire area. That meant establishing a perimeter, monitoring the trails, discouraging hikers from wandering off the main paths. David Chen had noticed someone marking trees, creating symbols that were not official trail markers. Thomas pulled out his notebook and sketched the symbol David had described, a circle with a line through it. It was simple, something that could be carved quickly, something that would weather the elements. But more importantly, it was a message. A warning to those who knew how to read it. Thomas made a decision. He needed to see the area for himself, needed to walk the trails and look for those symbols, see if they formed a pattern that would reveal what was being protected. But he also needed help, needed someone who could provide local knowledge, someone who knew these mountains better than any map could show. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for a name he had not called in over 2 years. Frank Morrison answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "This better be important, whoever you are." "Frank, it is Thomas Sullivan." There was a pause, then a surprised laugh. "Thomas? Thomas Sullivan? Well, I will be damned. I thought you had fallen off the face of the earth. What has it been, 2 years?" "About that," Thomas confirmed. "Listen, I know this is out of the blue, but I need your help with something. Are you still doing your wilderness guide work?" Frank Morrison was a former Army Ranger who had served with Thomas in their younger days. After leaving the service, Frank had moved to Oregon and built a successful business leading hunting and fishing expeditions into the backcountry. He knew the Pacific Northwest wilderness better than almost anyone, and more importantly, he understood how soldiers thought, how they approached problems. "I am," Frank said, and Thomas could hear the curiosity in his voice. "What do you need?" Thomas explained the situation, giving Frank the condensed version of David Chen's disappearance and the strange details in the trail journal. As he talked, he could hear Frank moving around, probably getting out of bed, the sound of a coffee maker starting in the background. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. "Those old mining areas near Eagle Creek," Frank said finally. "I know them. Most guides avoid that section because the trails are poorly maintained and the Forest Service actively discourages people from going there. But you are right that the closures are not airtight. I have seen signs over the years that someone is active in that region. Game cameras that do not belong to the state, fresh footprints where there should not be any, that kind of thing. I always figured it was just a hardcore survivalist or someone running a marijuana grow operation. But you never investigated, Thomas asked. Not my business, Frank said bluntly. I keep my clients safe and I do not go looking for trouble. But if you think this missing hiker stumbled into something he should not have, that changes things. When do you want to go take a look? As soon as possible, Thomas said. Tomorrow if you can manage it. I can clear my schedule, Frank agreed. But Thomas, if we are going into a potentially hostile area, we need to be prepared. This is not going to be a casual hike. We need gear, we need a plan, and we need backup communication. And you need to understand that if we find what I think we might find, we are not equipped to handle it ourselves. We would need to bring in law enforcement. I understand, Thomas said. But first we need to know if there is anything to find. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I will drive up tonight, get a motel near the trailhead. Frank gave him the name of a small town near Eagle Creek, a place where they could meet and finalize their plans. After hanging up, Thomas felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with mission planning, the sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. He was moving again, acting instead of wallowing. It felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in 3 years. He gathered his gear methodically, pulling items from the shelves in the garage that he had not touched since his retirement. His tactical backpack, still in good condition. His climbing harness and rope. His first aid kit, which he restocked from supplies he kept on hand. A tactical flashlight, a multi-tool, a compass that did not rely on batteries. He checked each item carefully, his hands remembering the routine even after years of disuse. Sergeant watched all of this with growing excitement, his tail wagging, his body practically vibrating with anticipation. The dog knew what these preparations meant. He knew they were going to work. Thomas pulled out Sergeant's working harness from a storage bin, the vest clearly marked K9 unit. The moment the dog saw it, he barked once, sharp and clear, then came to stand perfectly still while Thomas fitted it onto him, adjusting the straps for a snug but comfortable fit. Good boy, Thomas said, and he felt a lump in his throat. Sergeant was not young anymore, was not at the peak of his abilities, but the dog was ready. They both were. Thomas loaded his gear into his pickup truck, an old but reliable Ford that had carried him through countless adventures. He went into the house one last time, moving quietly through the kitchen. There was no sign of Margaret. Her bedroom door was closed, and he did not knock. Instead, he left a note on the kitchen table, kept it simple. Gone to help find a missing hiker. Will be back in a few days. I am sorry. Thomas. He did not know if sorry was enough. He suspected it was not. But it was all he had to offer. He and Sergeant loaded into the truck, and as they pulled out of the driveway, Thomas did not look back at the house. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the road ahead, on the mission, on the purpose that was calling him back to life. The drive to Oregon took most of the day. Thomas stopped twice for gas and food, sharing a sandwich with Sergeant at a rest stop, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to small towns to vast stretches of forest. The rain followed them, a constant gray presence that matched his mood. By evening, he had checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of the small town Frank had named. The room was basic but clean, and more importantly, it allowed dogs. Thomas laid out his gear on one of the twin beds, double-checking everything, running through scenarios in his mind. Sergeant sprawled on the floor, his energy spent from the long drive, already asleep. Thomas sat on the other bed and opened David Chen's trail journal again, reading the entries more carefully this time. The young man came across as thoughtful and observant, someone who genuinely loved the wilderness. He wrote about the changing light through the trees, about the sound of water over rocks, about the small moments of beauty that most people missed. Reading it made David feel real to Thomas, Not just a missing person report but an actual human being with thoughts and feelings and people who loved him. The last entry, the one about the strange man and the symbols, took on new weight. David had been curious, had intended to explore. That curiosity might have led him into danger. Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the knowledge that every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding David alive. 6 weeks was a long time. But people had survived longer in the wilderness, especially someone young and fit and knowledgeable about the outdoors. Thomas plugged his phone into the charger and set an alarm for early morning. He lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, and thought about Margaret. He wondered if she was thinking about him, if she was angry or sad or simply relieved that he was gone. He wondered if when he came back, there would even be a home to return to, or if she would have already started the process of ending their marriage. The thought should have filled him with panic, but instead, he felt a strange calm. He had made his choice. He had chosen to be who he was, to honor the training and experience that defined him, to try to help someone who needed it. If that cost him his marriage, then perhaps the marriage had been unsustainable anyway. You could not build a life with someone who wanted you to be fundamentally different than who you were. He reached down and let his hand rest on Sergeant's back, feeling the rise and fall of the dog's breathing. At least he had this partnership, this uncomplicated loyalty and trust. Whatever happened next, he would not be facing it alone. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, the sleep of a man who had finally stopped running from himself and started running towards something that mattered. The morning arrived cold and sharp, the kind of autumn dawn that carried the promise of winter in its breath. Thomas was awake before his alarm, his body already conditioned to rise early, his mind already running through the day's objectives. He showered quickly in the motel's cramped bathroom, dressed in layers suitable for hiking in unpredictable weather, and checked his gear one final time. Sergeant was alert and ready, his brown eyes tracking Thomas's every movement, his body language communicating eagerness. They met Frank Morrison at a diner on the edge of town, a small establishment that catered to loggers and outdoor workers. Frank was already there when Thomas arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a view of the parking lot, an old habit from their military days. He stood when he saw Thomas, and the two men embraced briefly, the kind of quick, solid hug that men who had seen combat together shared. Frank looked good for his 59 years. He was shorter than Thomas, stockier, with a weathered face tanned dark from years spent outdoors. His gray hair was cropped close to his skull, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He wore practical hiking clothes and heavy boots, and Thomas noticed the tactical knife clipped to his belt, another old habit that never quite went away. They ordered breakfast and spread a map on the table between them, speaking in low voices. Frank had marked several points of interest, places where he had noticed unusual activity over the years. The marks formed a pattern that aligned with Thomas's own analysis, confirming his suspicions about a controlled perimeter around the old mining areas. If someone is using those mines, Frank said, tracing a finger along a ridgeline, they would need to monitor the main approaches. That means lookout points here and here. They would also need supply routes, ways to get in and out without using the main trails. My guess is they are using old logging roads, maybe some of the mining access roads that are not on current maps. Thomas nodded, studying the terrain. The area was heavily forested, steep in places, with limited visibility. Perfect for hiding something you did not want found. We need to approach carefully, he said. If David stumbled into their operation, they might be watching for anyone else coming to look for him. Agreed, Frank said. We go in quiet, stay off the main trails, observe before we act. And if we see anything that suggests David is being held against his will or that there is active criminal operation, we pull back and call the authorities. We are not equipped to handle that kind of situation. Understood, Thomas confirmed. He appreciated Frank's caution, his professionalism. They were not young rangers anymore, full of invincibility and aggression. They were older, hopefully wiser, and they had to operate within their limitations. After breakfast, they drove in Frank's four-wheel drive vehicle to a remote trailhead that would give them access to the area from an unexpected angle. The parking lot was empty, which Frank said was normal for this time of year and this location. Most hikers stuck to the popular trails with waterfalls and scenic overlooks. This trail was overgrown, poorly maintained, the kind of path that only serious backcountry enthusiasts used. They geared up in silence, each man going through his own pre-mission ritual. Thomas fitted Sargent with his working harness, and the dog immediately shifted into his professional mode, his posture changing, his focus sharpening. Frank watched this transformation with appreciation. "That is one hell of a dog," he said quietly. "You are lucky to have him." "I know," Thomas replied, his hand resting briefly on Sargent's head. They had been through everything together, and whatever lay ahead, he trusted this animal with his life. The hike began easily enough, following a relatively clear path through old-growth forest. The trees here were massive, Douglas firs and western red cedars that had stood for centuries, their trunks so wide that 3 men could not encircle them with joined hands. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and moss, and the air smelled of dampness and decay, the eternal cycle of growth and decomposition that defined these ancient woods. They moved at a steady pace, not hurrying but not dawdling, covering ground efficiently. Frank led, his knowledge of the terrain evident in the way he navigated without constantly checking his compass. Thomas followed, with Sargent ranging slightly ahead, his nose working constantly, reading the air and ground for information invisible to human senses. After 2 hours, they reached the first marker. It was exactly as Davidson had described in his journal, a circle with a vertical line carved into the bark of a large hemlock tree. The carving was old enough to have weathered but recent enough to still be clearly visible. Thomas photographed it with his phone, then examined the surrounding area. From this position, they could see the main trail about 100 yards below them through the trees. "It is a site marker," Frank said quietly. "Someone standing here could watch hikers on that trail, could see if anyone was venturing off the path." They found 3 more markers over the next hour, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation. The pattern was clear and professional. Whoever had set up this perimeter knew what they were doing. This was not amateur work. Thomas felt his unease growing. They were dealing with someone organized, someone with resources and knowledge. Sargent suddenly stopped, his body going rigid, his nose pointed toward a dense thicket of young pine trees. He looked back at Thomas, then forward again, a clear communication. He had found something. Thomas signaled to Frank, and they approached cautiously, their movements careful and quiet. Behind the thicket, concealed from casual view, was a game camera mounted on a tree trunk. It was a high-end model, the kind used by serious hunters, capable of detecting motion and taking photos automatically. But what made Thomas's blood run cold was that the camera was pointed not at the ground where animals would pass, but at chest height, angled to capture the faces of humans walking on the trail below. "Someone is actively monitoring this area," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to know who is coming through here." Frank examined the camera without touching it. "There is no way to know if they check these daily or weekly. We have to assume they might know we are here." They moved more cautiously after that, staying well off the trails, using the terrain and vegetation for concealment. Thomas's old training came back to him naturally, the way to move through hostile territory, how to use shadows and natural cover, how to minimize noise and visual signature. Beside him, Frank moved with equal skill, and Sargent adapted his own movement to match theirs, becoming a ghost in the underbrush. The terrain began to change, becoming steeper, rockier. They were ascending toward the ridgeline that overlooked the old mining area. According to their maps, there should be several collapsed mine entrances along this ridge, shafts that had been sealed decades ago. But as they climbed higher, Sargent's behavior changed. The dog became more agitated, his nose working frantically, his body language communicating urgency. "He has got a scent," Thomas said, and he felt his heart rate increase. Sargent was trained to detect human remains, among other things. If he was alerting this strongly, it meant something significant was nearby. The dog led them off their planned route, pulling toward a section of the ridge that looked impassable, a wall of broken rock and dense vegetation. But Sargent was insistent, whining softly, pawing at the ground. Frank and Thomas pushed through the brush, ignoring the thorns that tore at their clothes, and emerged into a small clearing hidden behind the rock face. There, partially concealed by a tarp and brush, was a backpack. Thomas recognized it immediately from the photos Marcus Chen had shown him. It was David's pack, the distinctive blue and gray colors unmistakable. Thomas felt his stomach drop. They had found evidence, but not the kind he had hoped for. He approached carefully, taking photos before touching anything. The pack was still mostly intact, though it had obviously been exposed to weather. Inside, he found David's identification, his wallet with his cards still inside, his phone, the battery long dead. This was not a case of someone choosing to disappear. David had not left willingly. Frank had moved to the edge of the clearing and was examining something else. "Thomas," he called quietly, urgency in his voice. "You need to see this." Thomas joined him, and Frank pointed to the rock face. What had appeared to be a natural shadow was actually an opening, a mine entrance that had been carefully reopened. The collapsed rubble had been cleared away, and fresh tool marks were visible on the rock. Someone had gone to significant effort to make this mine accessible again while keeping it hidden from casual observation. Sargent was standing at the entrance, his body tense, his nose working at the air flowing from the darkness. He whined again, a sound of distress that Thomas had learned to interpret. The scent he was tracking led into that mine. David Chen had gone in there, or his body had been taken in there, and Sargent could smell it. Thomas pulled out his flashlight and aimed it into the opening. The beam penetrated maybe 30 feet before being swallowed by darkness. The mine shaft descended at a steep angle, the walls showing a mix of old timber supports and newer metal bracing. Someone had not just opened this mine. They had reinforced it, made it safe for regular use. "We need to call this in," Frank said firmly. "This is beyond what we can handle. If David is down there, if there are people using these mines for something illegal, we need law enforcement." Thomas knew Frank was right. The smart play, the safe play, was to back out, call the county sheriff, let trained professionals handle this. But he also knew that calling in authorities would take time. There would be jurisdictional discussions, warrant issues, tactical planning. It could be hours or even days before anyone went into that mine. And if David Chen was down there, if there was any chance he was still alive after 6 weeks, every hour mattered. "I am going in," Thomas said quietly. "Just to do a quick reconnaissance. See what we are dealing with. You stay here, keep watch, and if I'm not back in 1 hour, you make that call." "Thomas, that is insane," Frank protested. "You do not know what is down there. It could be structurally unsound, it could be guarded, it could be anything." "I know," Thomas said. "But I have to look. That young man's brother came to me for help. I cannot walk away without at least trying." Frank stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You always were the stubborn one. Fine. 1 hour. But I am timing you, and if you are not back, I am calling in the cavalry whether you like it or not." Thomas checked his gear, made sure his flashlight had fresh batteries, clipped a backup light to his belt. He looked down at Sargent, and the dog looked back, waiting for his command. Thomas knew he should leave the dog outside, that bringing Sargent into an unknown environment was a risk. But he also knew that the dog's senses would give him an advantage, would alert him to dangers he might not see or hear. "Stay close," he commanded, and Sargent moved to his side, pressing against his leg. Thomas entered the mine, Frank's worried face the last thing he saw before the darkness enveloped them. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying a mineral smell mixed with something else, something organic that made his nose wrinkle. The floor was uneven, littered with loose rock and old debris, and Thomas had to watch his footing carefully. Sargent moved beside him with sure steps, the dog's superior night vision and sense of smell guiding him through the darkness. The shaft descended for about 50 feet, then leveled out into what appeared to be a main tunnel. Thomas could see evidence of recent activity here. The dust on the floor was disturbed by footprints, multiple sets, some relatively fresh. Along one wall were stacked plastic crates, the kind used for storage or transport. Thomas approached them carefully and opened one. Inside were mason jars filled with clear liquid. He unscrewed one lid and sniffed cautiously, immediately recognizing the sharp, chemical smell of methamphetamine. This mine was being used as a drug lab and storage facility. The discovery changed everything. This was not just someone hiding out in the wilderness. This was organized crime, likely connected to one of the cartels that had been expanding their operations into rural America. These people would be armed, dangerous, and absolutely willing to kill to protect their operation. If David Chen had stumbled onto this, he would have been seen as a lethal threat. Thomas knew he should turn back immediately, that this was exactly the kind of situation Frank had warned against. But Sargent was pulling forward, deeper into the mine, his nose tracking a scent with absolute certainty. The dog was following David's trail, and Thomas could not bring himself to abandon it now. They moved deeper, the tunnel branching several times. Thomas marked his route with chalk, a trick from his military days to ensure he could find his way back. The mine was larger than he had expected, a warren of interconnected passages that suggested the original mining operation had been extensive. Some passages were collapsed, blocked by fallen timber and rock, but others had been cleared and were clearly in active use. In one chamber, Thomas found what looked like a living space. There were sleeping bags laid out on pallets, empty food containers, battery-powered lanterns. This was where the workers stayed, people who were probably cooking the drugs in shifts, living underground to avoid detection. The space was currently empty, but it had been used recently. The food containers were not yet moldy. Sargent led him past this chamber and into a narrower tunnel that seemed older, less stable. The timber supports here were original, dating back over a century, and they creaked ominously. Thomas was about to call the dog back, to decide that they had gone far enough, when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A sound. Faint, barely audible over his own breathing. But unmistakable. A human voice, calling weakly from somewhere ahead. "Help," the voice said, the words stretched thin with desperation. "Please, someone help me." Thomas moved forward quickly, caution warring with urgency. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and there, chained to a support beam by his ankle, was David Chen. The young man was alive, but barely. He was emaciated, his clothes filthy and torn, his face gaunt and covered in bruises. His eyes widened when Thomas's flashlight beam hit him, and he raised a hand to shield his face from the brightness. "David Chen," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. "My name is Thomas Sullivan. Your brother Marcus sent me to find you. You are going to be okay." David's face crumpled, and he began to sob, the sound of someone who had given up hope and suddenly had it returned. "They have been keeping me here," he managed through his tears. "Weeks. I do not even know how long. They said they would kill me if I tried to leave, if I made noise." Thomas moved to examine the chain. It was heavy-gauge steel, secured to the beam with a padlock. He did not have tools to break it, but he pulled out his multi-tool and began working on the beam itself, which was old and partly rotted. "How many of them are there?" he asked David while he worked. "3, usually," David said. "Sometimes 4. They come and go. They bring food, not much. They have guns, all of them. They said I saw too much, that I had to stay here until they decided what to do with me." Thomas had gotten the chain loose enough to slip off the beam, though David was still shackled by the ankle. "Can you walk?" Thomas asked. "I think so," David said, struggling to his feet with Thomas's help. He swayed, weak from malnutrition and lack of movement, but he stayed upright. "Let me get you out of here." They made their way back through the tunnels, Thomas supporting David's weight, Sargent leading the way. The journey that had taken Thomas 15 minutes to descend took nearly 30 to climb, David's weakness slowing them considerably. Thomas kept checking his watch, aware that his hour deadline was approaching, that Frank would be preparing to call for help. They were almost to the entrance when Thomas heard voices echoing from somewhere behind them in the mine. Men's voices, speaking Spanish, getting closer. The workers were returning. Thomas increased their pace, half carrying David now, knowing that if they were caught in these narrow tunnels they would have no chance. They burst out of the mine entrance into daylight that seemed blindingly bright after the darkness. Frank was there, his face flooding with relief when he saw them, then shock when he saw David's condition. "We need to move," Thomas gasped. "They are coming. Right behind us." Frank did not waste time on questions. He took David's other arm, and together they half ran, half stumbled into the forest, putting distance between themselves and the mine. Behind them, Thomas could hear shouts of alarm as the men discovered their prisoner was gone. They made it perhaps 200 yards before David collapsed, his body simply giving out. Thomas and Frank dragged him into a dense thicket and crouched beside him, breathing hard. Sargent lay across David's legs, keeping the young man warm and calm with his solid presence. Frank already had his satellite phone out, calling 911, reporting their position and the situation. Thomas could hear more voices now, multiple men, spreading out through the forest, searching. They were being hunted. "Law enforcement is en route," Frank said after ending the call. "But it is going to be at least 20 minutes, maybe longer. We need to stay hidden and stay quiet." Those were a very long 20 minutes. Thomas could hear the searchers moving through the forest, sometimes coming dangerously close to their hiding spot. He kept his hand on Sargent's collar, keeping the dog still and silent, while David lay between them, his breathing shallow and rapid. The young man was in shock, his body shutting down after weeks of trauma and deprivation. Thomas heard a helicopter before he saw it, the distinctive thump of rotors echoing off the mountains. Then came the sound of vehicles, lots of them, and suddenly the forest was filled with law enforcement officers, sheriff's deputies, and state police fanning out in tactical formation. The men who had been hunting them melted back into the woods, vanishing like smoke. "Over here," Thomas called, and within moments they were surrounded by armed officers, paramedics rushing forward to treat David. Thomas gave a brief statement to a detective, pointing out the location of the mine entrance, describing what he had seen inside. The detective's face grew increasingly grim as Thomas spoke, and he radioed for additional units, for drug enforcement agents, for a tactical team. David Chin was loaded onto a stretcher and carried down to a waiting ambulance. Before they took him away, he grabbed Thomas's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You saved my life. Tell Marcus I am sorry for worrying him. Tell him I am coming home." Thomas nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. He watched the paramedics carry David away, watched the organized chaos of law enforcement responding to a major drug operation, and felt a profound sense of completion. This was what he had trained for, what he was meant to do. Not pushing papers in an office, not pretending to be someone he was not, but using his skills to make a real difference in the world. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "You crazy bastard," he said with a grin. "You actually did it. You found him alive." "We did it," Thomas corrected, including Sargent with a gesture. "Could not have done it without both of you." The aftermath took hours. There were statements to give, evidence to document, questions to answer. Thomas learned that the mine operation had been under surveillance for months by a multi-agency task force, but they had not been able to establish probable cause for a raid. David's rescue provided that cause, and by evening, a dozen arrests had been made, and the entire operation had been shut down. It was late when Thomas and Frank finally made it back to the trailhead parking lot. They were exhausted, filthy, and elated. Marcus Chin had been notified that his brother was alive and was already driving to the hospital where David was being treated. Thomas had spoken to him briefly on the phone, hearing the overwhelming relief and gratitude in the young man's voice. As Thomas loaded his gear into his truck, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Margaret. "Just saw the news. You found him. I should have known you would. We need to talk when you get home." Thomas stared at the message for a long time, trying to read between the lines, to understand what it meant. Was she angry? Was she proud? Was she saying goodbye or asking him to stay? He did not know, but he knew he had to find out. He drove through the night, Sargent sleeping in the passenger seat, the miles passing in a blur of fatigue and reflection. He thought about David Chen, about how close they had come to not finding him, about how a young man's life had hung in the balance and how his own decision to ignore his wife's ultimatum had made the difference. He thought about Margaret, about their failing marriage, about whether love was enough when two people wanted fundamentally different things from life. The sun was rising when Thomas pulled into his driveway. The house looked the same as when he had left, quiet and still in the early morning light. He sat in the truck for a moment, gathering his courage, then climbed out and walked to the front door. It was unlocked, which he took as a good sign. Margaret was in the kitchen, already dressed for work though it was barely dawn. She had clearly not slept. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red from crying, her face pale with exhaustion. They stared at each other across the kitchen, two people who had shared a life for decades but who felt like strangers. "I saw the news," she said again. "You saved that young man's life. His brother was on television, talking about you, about what you did." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I realized something while you were gone. I have been asking you to be someone you are not. I have been asking you to cut out the part of yourself that makes you who you are. And that is not fair. That is not love." Thomas felt hope kindle in his chest, but he kept silent, letting her speak. "But I also need you to understand something," Margaret continued, and her voice broke slightly. "I have been lonely, Thomas. So lonely. And I cannot keep living like that. If you are going to do this kind of work, if you are going to keep being the hero, then I need to be part of it. I need to understand it. I need you to let me in instead of shutting me out in this garage with your maps and your memories." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "You are right. I have been shutting you out. I have been living in the past because the present felt too hard, because I did not know how to be a civilian, how to be a husband. But I want to try. If you are willing to give me another chance, I want to try." Margaret walked across the kitchen and stood in front of him, reaching up to touch his bearded face. "I saw your maps," she said. "While you were gone, I went into the garage and I really looked at them. Each one tells a story, does it not? Each one is a place where you made a difference. And I realized they are not junk. They are your life. And maybe instead of asking you to throw them away, I should be asking you to share them with me." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, feeling her body shake with sobs against his chest. They stood like that for a long time, two broken people trying to find their way back to each other, trying to build something new from the wreckage of what they had lost. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Margaret began the slow work of rebuilding their marriage. He cleared out one of the spare rooms in the house and turned it into a proper map room, organizing his collection properly, creating a space that honored his past while being open to Margaret. She spent evenings with him there, listening to his stories, understanding for the first time the magnitude of what he had done, the lives he had touched. Marcus Chin came to visit, bringing David with him. David was still recovering, still thin and haunted, but alive and surrounded by family. He thanked Thomas again, his gratitude profound and genuine. The media attention from the rescue had been significant, and Thomas found himself being contacted by other families with missing loved ones, people who had exhausted official channels and needed someone with his particular skills. Thomas started taking select cases, always with Margaret's knowledge and support, always with Sargent by his side. He and Frank Morrison formed a small volunteer search and rescue operation, helping families find closure, bringing people home. It gave Thomas purpose, gave his skills meaning, gave his life direction. One evening, several months after David's rescue, Thomas and Margaret sat together in the map room. Sargent lay at their feet, content and calm. Margaret was examining a map of the Pacific coast, asking questions about a mission Thomas had run there years ago. As he explained the details, showing her the routes and the challenges, he realized that she was truly listening, truly interested, not just humoring him. "This is who you are," Margaret said softly. "This map collection, these stories, this need to help people. I should have seen it sooner. I should have understood. And I should have let you in sooner," Thomas replied. "Should have trusted you with this part of me instead of keeping it locked away." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Margaret said, "You know, I have been thinking. What if we did something with these maps? What if we created a foundation or a resource center for families of missing persons? You could teach other people your skills, train volunteers. We could make this bigger than just you. Thomas looked at her, seeing the excitement in her eyes, the engagement, and felt something shift in his chest. This was the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago, the partner he had lost sight of. I think that is a brilliant idea, he said. They began planning immediately, mapping out not a wilderness route but a future, a shared purpose that combined Thomas's skills with Margaret's organizational abilities. The garage that had been a point of contention became a symbol of possibility, its walls covered not just with maps of where Thomas had been, but with plans for where they were going together. Sargent watched it all with his wise brown eyes, the faithful companion who had never doubted, who had always known that his human would find his way home. Up next, you have got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.